where did life come from? There's two possibilities. Either life was the result of undirected material processes, or rather there was some kind of intelligent agent or mind that was shaping the material processes. Either there was mind or there was no mind. The discoveries of modern science have been more consistent with the expectations that are generated from a theistic hypothesis than they are from a materialistic hypothesis. Arno Penzias was quoted as saying that the best data we have are exactly what I would have expected if we had nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Science was born of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Dawkins has inadvertently discovered it. He's opened the floodgates to all sorts of irrational ideologies, and the science that he prizes is being swept away in the flood. I find the faith to be very rational. It matches what you would expect to see in the world around us based on the revelation of the biblical text.
My guest today, Professor Stephen Meyer, is a man of extraordinary intellectual reach in both science and philosophy. He has a PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He's a former geophysicist and college professor, and he now directs Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. His most recent book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Well, Professor Meyer, Steve, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time for a conversation that I think will be very interesting to a lot of people.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I would like to kick off by asking you to tell us in your language what intelligent design is and what was your, if you like, intellectual journey towards it.
Well, thank you. Brief answer on the what is intelligent design. It's the theory that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by the activity of a designing intelligence rather than undirected material processes, such as in the area of biology, the undirected process of mutation and natural selection. And the kind of features that we would be talking about would be things like in physics, what's physicists often call the fine-tuning of the physical parameters of the universe, the laws and constants of physics. In biology, the miniature machines that are being discovered inside cells, the rotary engines, the sliding clamps, the circuitry in cells. And I think most fundamentally, the discovery at the very foundation of life and even the simplest living cells, the digital information that's stored in the DNA and RNA molecules that is crucial to all forms of life. So those features, we would argue, the molecular machines, the digital code, the fine-tuning of the physical laws, these are features that are best explained as the product of a designing intelligence rather than some undirected material process. And that's the key claim of the theory of intelligent design.
I have, of course, heard of it before. Most people have. Interestingly, around 25 years ago, I was at a formal lunch as Deputy Prime Minister of Australia with my opposite number from Pakistan at the time. Now, he was a Muslim, and he asked me, did I think intelligent design was an argument for the existence of God, and went on to explain, before I could say anything, that surely if I went to the moon and found a watch or a wine glass, they were the two examples he used, that would be clear evidence of intelligent design. Somebody had designed them and you wouldn't question it. And he was saying that, to his way of thinking, the same applied to the natural order around us.
Yeah, it's an old argument, and in fact, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, at least. The Greeks, the Romans, the medieval Christians, the There have been Islamic philosophers that have made the argument, Jewish philosophers. What is new, and this relates to the second half of your question that I forgot to answer about my own journey into this, is that the argument has been updated and I think made more rigorous by developments not only in physics and biology, the empirical natural sciences, but also by developments in the mathematical sciences that have allowed us to refine and develop more precise methods of design detection. The key question is, how do you tell when something is designed by an intelligence and when is it not? And there have been breakthroughs, I think, in our understanding of the key criteria that allow us to detect the activity of a prior intelligent agent. It turns out that we do that all the time. And we can come back to that. My own journey into this way of thinking began as a young scientist. I was working as a geophysicist for an oil exploration company, and a conference came to the city where I was working that was investigating the big questions at the intersection between science and philosophy: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness were the three questions on the docket. And I attended this conference and was especially taken with the discussion of the origin of life problem, as it was then called by then in the mid 80s. It had for a long time been in textbooks explained as the product of the origin of the very first life we're talking about, the origin of the cell. And it was sort of assumed that because of the success of Darwinian evolution, that explaining the origin of the very first cell would be easy by reference to some sort of analogous evolutionary process. But by the mid 1980s, the field had come to a place of impasse, and the key question that was unanswered was, how do you explain, or where does the information present in the cell come from? How do you get from pure chemistry in an allegedly prebiotic environment to the code that makes all of life possible? And that proved to be, at the time, a very difficult question. And I think subsequent to that time, it's become, I think in the eyes of many people studying this problem, a nearly unbridgeable divide. That chemistry does not give you code. These are operating at different levels. And I became fascinated with the question when I first encountered leading scientists discussing the problem of explaining the origin of the information, particularly in the DNA molecule. If you go back to the late 1950s, you have the discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule by Watson and Crick, and then in 1957 and 58, Crick formulates what he calls the sequence hypothesis, which was the idea that along the interior of the famed double helix molecule, the twisting helix, there are chemical subunits of the molecule that are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like digital characters, zeros and ones in a section of machine code. And the idea was that these digital characters are performing a function in the cell. They're directing the construction of mechanical parts, the proteins and the protein machines, but they do so in virtue of their precise arrangement in accord with a code. It's not their chemical properties or their physical properties. It's not their mass. It's not their shape. It's their arrangement in accord with a code. So you have something that's fundamentally not, it's contained in a chemical model or in a chemical molecule, but it's not the chemical properties of the constituents that give them their function. It's their information-bearing properties. And so the question becomes, where does the information come from? And I became fascinated with this. I was working in digital signal processing in for an oil company doing seismic work, and the signal processing, it was a form of information technology. And I became very fascinated to think that the secret, the ultimate question around how life got here on the planet, essentially turned on this crucial question of the origin of information, the origin of the code. And a year later, I was off to Cambridge in England. I ended up doing a master's degree in the history and philosophy of science, and then my master's and PhD thesis were on origin of life biology. And so I got hooked on the topic.
Well, for a non-scientist like me, when you talk about the information contained in DNA, it does seem, I have to say, intellectually enormously challenging to think how on earth do these things you can never see with the naked eye pass on so much information. You and I are grandfathers. You don't look like you're anywhere near old enough to be a grandfather, but I do. I know that. But when you see those traits coming through, you can see that extraordinary information that's been passed on. It's not just another human life. It's clearly descended from those who have given rise to its birth. Is this what we're sort of talking about here?
Yeah, exactly, John. This was a perennial and long-standing question in biology. The most obvious observation that you can make about living things is that like begets like, that organisms, the new group of organisms are like their parents. So there was always a question: what is it that ensures that there is that transmission of the blueprint, of the pattern, and there was the thought there must be something transmitting some sort of signal that is carrying instructions or information in some way to ensure that the fidelity of that form from one generation to another. And the intensity around that question quickened in the 1930s and 40s as scientists began to suspect it had something to do with this molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. And it was in 52, 53 that Crick and Watson were able to elucidate the structure, to formulate a model of what the DNA molecule was like. The model suggested that there was that it was an information carrier. And in 1958, Crick really nailed this with something he called the sequence hypothesis that I was talking about just a minute ago, and in many ways, I think it was a more significant achievement than even elucidating the structure of the molecule itself, is that he realized that the DNA was carrying information in the form of a 4-character code. It was essentially digital. And in fact, one of the prominent physicists at the time, George Gamow, realized that the DNA, the 4, they're called nucleotide bases, could be, it was their arrangement in accord with a code later discerned called the genetic code that allowed the DNA to convey instructions for building the crucial protein molecules that do all the important jobs inside cells. So it was essentially a system very much like our modern digital printers or CAD/CAM technology, where you have digital information directing the construction of 3-dimensional mechanical parts and systems that do in the cell specific jobs. So you got digital information directing the construction of protein molecules that perform functions in virtue of their 3-dimensional shapes and characteristics. So fascinating information processing system. Is really an information storage, transmission, and processing system was discovered in the 1950s and 60s at the foundation of even the simplest living cells. And so if you're thinking about the problem of the origin of life, you have to begin to explain or come up with a theory that can explain life as we find it. And as we began to realize that life was much more complex than the ideas that were prevalent in Darwin's time, when his famous bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley, said that life is a homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. His idea was it was kind of an enclosure with jello on the inside. Well, the jello turned out to include a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system that was building molecular machines. And that set the bar a lot higher for any would-be origin of life explanation, because it had to explain life as we find it, the life as it is. And life as it is, we now know, is much more complex than what we thought it was in Darwin's time in the 1850s and 60s.
If you go to Wikipedia, it will describe intelligent design as pseudoscience, which I would have thought was rather patronizing, given that the scientific method means I think you put up a hypothesis and then keep testing it, which I take it is exactly what you've been referring to in a way. But on what basis would it be referred to as a pseudoscience?
Well, there has been a tacit rule in. We've also been called creationists in cheap tuxedos, which is so the rhetoric around this issue has been somewhat intemperate. And I personally paid a lot for my tuxedo, so I was really offended by that. But anyway, seriously, the rule that is in the minds of many scientists that leads to that designation, intelligent design is pseudoscience, is a convention of method that began to be popular in the late 19th century, a little bit after beginning with Darwin and then afterwards. And the rule is sometimes it's a big term. It's called methodological naturalism or methodological materialism. And the idea is that if you're going to be a scientist, you have to explain everything by reference to undirected material processes. And therefore, you cannot, as a scientist, consider the possibility that a mental agent or mind or conscious intelligence or creative intelligence played a role in the origin of even of life or the universe. You have to stick to purely material processes as your mode of explanation. Now, the obvious problem with that is that there are many things in life or many things in our experience that were produced by processes other than the strictly material. That is to say, that were produced by creative intelligence. We don't explain the origin of the iPhone without reference to Steve Jobs, or the origin of the automobile without reference to Benz or Ford. There are there are systems all around us that are the product of intelligence, and we know them to be the products of intelligence by examining the characteristics that they have. If you walk into the British Museum and you see that wonderful display of the Rosetta Stone with the three different languages, or three texts from three different languages etched in the stone, the archaeologists who discover that did not say, oh, well, it must have been wind and erosion, because if we infer that a scribe was involved, we'd be breaking the rules of science. No, rather, they followed the evidence where it most logically led based on our knowledge of cause and effect. And the case for intelligent design is based on a standard method of historical scientific reasoning where our knowledge of cause and effect guides the inferences we make about what the most likely cause of an event was in the past. So if you look at the Rosetta Stone, you see an information-rich inscription. We know that it takes a mind to generate information, and therefore, based on that cause and effect knowledge, when we see the information apart from observing the cause, we can still infer back to the cause, because we know the only known cause of information, whether it's in a hieroglyphic or alphabetic form, is a mind. And in a very similar way, the inference to design in biology is based on a standard method of reasoning in which we prioritize our knowledge of cause and effect in making the inferences. We know that it takes we know that it takes a mind to generate information, and therefore, when we find information in a digital form in the DNA, the most logical thing to conclude is that a mind was also involved in its origin. Our local hero here in the Seattle area, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. Richard Dawkins, the staunch evolutionary biologist and atheist from Oxford, has acknowledged that DNA is like a machine code. And we know that machine code or software comes from a programmer. So the discovery of information in an alphabetic or digital form provides strong evidence of the prior activity of a designing intelligence. That's not breaking the rules of science. It's following the most fundamental rule of science, which is to follow the evidence where it leads to the best explanation or the most likely cause.
Interestingly, the arguments for and against the existence of God have despite the best efforts of many scientists to imply that evolutionary theory does away with the need for the idea of a God. It's a little old now, but some research was done on one of our major university campuses here a few years ago. If you approached a group of university students and asked them about the question of the existence of God, about half would say, no, there's no God. About half would, nervously say, well, yes, I think there is. If you approached them individually, the number of people who said, yes, I believe in a God, jumped massively. You get this sort of scorn effect that makes people reluctant to own. And interestingly, if you ask them the question, well, then why do you actually believe? By far the most common answer is, look at the natural world around me. It can't be an accident. So there's a sense in which this is not as clear cut as those who would say, oh, it's just pseudoscience, would have you believe. It's not cutting through to people in real world living.
Sorry to interrupt, John. Yeah, no. I was just going to say, notice something about the rhetorical move there. To say something is pseudoscience is to imply that there is some definition of science or some rules of science that must be followed in order to qualify as science. It is an appeal to, but then if you ask people, well, what is your definition of science? People get famously ambiguous in their answers. They'll say something about, well, science has science is following the scientific method. But what we've shown, this has been part of the focus of my work from my PhD on, is that the method of reasoning that's used to determine that intelligent design played a role in the origin of the information necessary to life is the exact same method that Darwin himself used. It was a method of historical scientific reasoning where, again, our knowledge of cause and effect is used to guide our thinking, our inferences about what is the most likely cause to have been present to produce the thing that we see. And so if people want to apply the standard of, their definition of science even-handedly, then if they say intelligent design isn't science, they'd have to say that Darwinian evolution isn't science or that chemical evolutionary theory isn't science. But really, you don't settle these important empirical questions by appealing to definitions. You have to settle them by appealing to our knowledge of the evidence itself, and by using established methods of reasoning that are independent of metaphysical biases. When I mentioned a few minutes ago that the reason that people will say intelligent design isn't science is because they've adopted tacitly a rule of reasoning which says you can't consider an explanation that involves creative intelligence. Well, that's a biased definition of science. It's one which is cooking the books. If you think of the origins question, where did life come from? There's two basic possibilities. Either life was the result of undirected material processes, or rather there was some kind of intelligent agent or mind that was shaping the material processes. Either there was mind or there was no mind. Those are two logical possibilities. And if you decide in advance that you're not going to consider creative intelligence as a possible explanation, then well, certainly you will end up affirming that life was produced by purely undirected material processes. But notice in making that determination, you haven't appealed to any evidence. You've only appealed to your definition that science must limit itself to materialistic explanations. So it's a definition that ends up becoming very circular in that it determines the outcome of the investigation irrespective of investigating any actual evidence. And what we're doing in the intelligent design research community is not only making an evidential argument for intelligent design, we're challenging this rule, which we think to be anti-scientific and anti-intellectual, in that it's limiting the intellectual freedom of the scientists to consider all possible explanations, irrespective of metaphysical preferences.
The impression I have is that you're not actually quite alone. There have been some very significant scientific thinkers over recent decades who have, willingly or unwillingly, come to the conclusion that the laws by which everything operates, if you like, the rules, the information that's plainly passed on, present such overwhelming evidence that there must have been a mastermind behind it, that in fact it's not true to say for a moment that scientists would say science disproves God. There are far too many scientists who have shifted in their thinking, even if it's only to a deist position, not necessarily a Christian or specific, religion of the types that we recognize.
Yeah, absolutely. Many non-religious theists now who have come to believe in a transcendent intelligence responsible both for the origin of the universe at the beginning, which is another big and mysterious question. How did the universe, the material universe, come into existence? Our best physics tells us that matter, space, time, and energy all originated a finite time ago, before which, or to be more precise, since we don't have time, independent of which there was no matter to do the causing. So materialism as a worldview, as a system of thought, has come up against a number of very profound questions. In your country, there's a very prominent young physicist, Luke Barnes, who's written a book with his former Cambridge PhD supervisor. He's now a professor at Western Sydney, called The Fortunate Universe, that is looking at the evidence of the fine-tuning of the physical parameters of the universe, and suggesting that most logically the fine-tuning of those parameters suggests a fine-tuner. We have all of these, the basic parameters of physics turn out to fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances, outside of which not only life but even basic chemistry would be impossible. And the question is, how did these different parameters find one after another, find those sweet spots that make life possible? And many physicists, including Sir Fred Hoyle, who was one of the first scientists who discovered these parameters, have come to the conclusion that the fine-tuning is pointing to a transcendent intelligence that is responsible for the life-friendly structure of the universe as a whole. So there's I think a fairly significant revolution in thought taking place. There's been a shift even in the last 20 years in my involvement in this work. There was a lot of the type of rhetoric that you find on Wikipedia, where people would simply dismiss the idea out of hand. People would appeal to authority. They appeal to a consensus that may or may not have existed. And now I think you find people taking these arguments very seriously, not only in biology, but also in physics and in cosmology. In my last book, I was fortunate to have endorsements from 7 professors who held named professorships in different fields of science, a Nobel laureate. It's by no means an idea that's confined to parochial sort of backwoods of the American Appalachia or something, as it's often portrayed. People, white-shoed Bible thumpers, are the only people thinking about this. It's very serious scientists and philosophers are considering these arguments. And I'd even go back a bit and look at someone like James Clerk Maxwell, who was, along with Newton and Einstein, in fact, all 3 of those great physicists believed that there was a mind behind the universe. Einstein's way of formulating it was not traditionally religious. Newton and Maxwell were both devout Christians. Maxwell said that the conclusion of design follows inexorably from the application of the laws of thought to the observations of the world around us. In other words, there are features that we see in nature which we know, one of the key laws of thought, only arise from a particular kind of cause, an intelligent cause, and therefore we can infer back to a designing agent. So you had really prominent scientists have affirmed this design argument from the period of the scientific revolution forward, and even going back further into scientific and philosophical history. So this is a perennial idea. It's been a perennial argument in the West. Did mind come first, or was it brute matter? These were the 2 great systems of thought that you found in the ancient Greeks. So what we're doing is we're reviving the case for the mind first view of reality based on fundamental discoveries that have been made in physics, in cosmology, in biology over the last 100 years.
Can I ask you then about the theory of evolution? It does seem to me that there are certain big issues within the theory that are far from settled, and that therefore it actually remains a theory, not something that's settled by, as you put it, consensus, in the way that is assumed by, I suppose, a lot of people in Western culture.
Yeah, it's always been a theory. The question is whether it's been the best theory or not, or whether it's been a well-supported theory. And I would say there are some obvious difficulties with the theory that are increasingly well known. I attended a conference at the Royal that was convened by the Royal Society in London in 2016, and it was convened by a group of mainly evolutionary biologists who were quite disaffected with the standard neo-Darwinian theory that we all learn in university textbooks. And they were actually calling for a new theory of evolution because the theory that we have is, in their view, inadequate. About 20% of the scientists who attended that conference were also proponents of intelligent design, though most of us were kept a little lower profiles, not to cause too much angst among our evolutionary colleagues. But the big reason for the concern about the adequacy of Darwinism is the lack of the perceived lack of creative power of the mutation natural selection mechanism, allegedly the main creative force or mechanism that drives the evolutionary process. It turns out that the mutation natural selection mechanism does a very nice job of explaining small-scale variation, the types of things that are often presented as the main evidence for evolution in textbooks, things like the variation in the size and shape of the finch beaks of the famous Galapagos finches that Darwin wrote about, or the famous peppered moths, the coloration of which turned dark to light and dark again in the with varying levels of industrial pollution in the Midlands of England. But the theory does a good job of explaining those kinds of small scale variations in coloration or superficial characteristics of organisms. It doesn't do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or insects or mammals or animal body plans in the first place. And so when you couple that concern with the evidence we have from the history of life, namely that there are these abrupt, discontinuous appearances of new forms of life in the fossil record, not the continuous gradual unfolding of the history of life in a tree-like manner, as Darwin described, but rather what have been called biological big bangs, the origin of the major body plans in the Cambrian explosion. I've written a whole book about that called Darwin's Doubt. The origin of winged insects, the origin of turtles, the origin of birds, the origin of the angiosperm, the flowering plants, the origin of the mammals. All of these events and more arise very abruptly in the fossil record. It's not a Darwinian picture of gradual incremental change. So that's a problem, just reading the historical record. But then as you begin to look at how the mechanism works, again, it does a nice job of preserving small-scale variations, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining the origin of major innovations in the history of life, the mutation selection mechanism. And there the problem turns out to be the same problem that is affecting origin of life research, and that is the problem of information. And this all came basically as biologists began to reflect on what Watson and Crick and the molecular biologists in the 50s and 60s were discovering. They realized, hey, we got a problem here. This whole mechanism of mutating pre-existing information doesn't seem like a very good way of generating new information. If you think of computer code and you start to make random changes in zeros and ones, are you going to change a section of functioning code into a new program or operating system, or are you more likely to simply degrade the existing program and destroy it? And essentially, mutations are operating in the same way that mutations are random changes in a digital bit string. And we know from the computer world that if you make random changes in a digital bit string, you're going to degrade the information carrying sequence so it will not perform a function long before you will ever change it enough to produce a new function, a new program or operating system. So understanding the primacy of information has led to profound doubts about the creative power of the mutation natural selection mechanism. So you have both a problem with the historical record doesn't match what you'd expect from Darwinian evolution, and the mechanism that supposedly drove all the major evolutionary processes doesn't seem to have the power to do that. So there's a kind of a twin difficulties that have afflicted the theory.
Imagine for a moment we could bring Charles Darwin personally back to the table for this conversation, in view of what you've just pointed to, the problem of new forms of life, if you like, appearing that don't show any direct linkage with evolution, the sudden emergence, so to speak, but also the incredible complexity you've been talking about, the information contained in DNA. How do you think he would have responded to what we now know and the challenges or the holes, the gaps that are still there in evolutionary theory? He was plainly a very intelligent man.
Plainly, and his book was beautifully written, and it was a masterpiece of scientific argumentation based on the evidence and observations that he had made at the time. But it did acknowledge certain difficulties that have only become more acute over time. One of them was this discontinuous pattern of appearance of new biological form in the fossil record. I wrote a whole book called Darwin's Doubt. Darwin's Doubt was about the adequacy of his theory to explain an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, where you have the first major explosion of new animal form in the fossil record, at least the majority of the animal body plants first arising. And Darwin openly acknowledged that he could not explain that class of evidence in 1859. And I show in the book that problem and many related problems have only become more acute in the ensuing 160 years. So it's hard to speculate on how Darwin himself would have responded. I would hope that he would be enough of a scientist to follow the evidence where it leads and not be beholden to the rule of methodological naturalism, which would prevent him from considering the design hypothesis. I think one of the interesting things about Darwin's work was that he was very much engaging the other side of the argument in his work. He was aware of the long tradition in biology of science-based, biology-based design arguments. And so many of his arguments were posed as counter-arguments to those other arguments which were part of the tradition of the biological sciences to that point. Many of what I call Darwin's current public defenders are not as open-minded. They want to act as if those arguments don't even exist, and that just it's to be a scientist is simply to read a materialistic conclusion into every observation. And I think Darwin was a bit more open than that. In fact, he was very open in acknowledging the problem of the Cambrian explosion and also the difficulty posed by the functional integration of parts in complex systems, which is something that contemporary intelligent design proponents have picked up in works like Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. These miniature machines and circuits that have many parts that are functioning as an integrated whole and do not admit gradual change without defect to the whole, the origin of which are very difficult to explain in a gradual way.
Now, as I mentioned, I'm not a scientist, but I'm very aware. Let's assume for a moment that we've still got Charles sitting at the table with us. He was a man who plainly was thoughtful and worried about the impact of his theory on society, how it might play out in philosophy, Would it damage religion? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if we still have him at the table, the reality is that we have to say it's not necessarily his fault, but his theory gave rise to some very, very serious problems. You know, all sorts of groups jumped on the theory to justify their views of what society ought to be like. But the most egregious and obvious one is plainly the way in which the Nazis and Mussolini and people like that jumped on the idea of the survival of the fittest.
It's alas very unfortunate. There's an historian of science, Richard Weikart, who has written extensively on this, and it's extraordinary when you open Mein Kampf and the references to survival of the fittest, natural selection, evolutionary ideas are suffused. They're throughout the book. The story that Weikart tells is that Darwin influenced obviously the social Darwinists in the United Kingdom, but his ideas, because they were found. The essential thing is that Darwinism became an indispensable plank in materialistic systems of thought of all types. Every worldview or philosophy, metaphysical system has to answer the fundamental question that philosophers call ontology, or worldview scholars call the prime reality question. What is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else came? In Judeo-Christian religion, in the Islamic faith, that answer is provided in terms of a personal God. In materialism, the answer is always matter and energy. And what Darwin argued was that matter and energy could essentially, strictly material processes, the process of natural selection in particular, could explain the origin of new forms of life from pre-existing forms of life. There were other evolutionary theorists, Haeckel and Huxley in particular, who quickly applied that to the question of the origin of the first life. And then Darwin himself came back in writing the Descent of Man, in applying his ideas to the origin of human beings. And so by the end of the 19th century, you have this kind of seamless materialistic story that can be told from the origin of the solar system to the origin of the great geological features, to the origin of life, to the origin of new forms of life, to the origin of human beings, all as the product of undirected, mindless, materialistic processes. And so you get these various systems of materialistic thought arising, and the great 20th century political ideologies, both Marxism and National Socialism, and Western social Darwinism, are all drawing on that same origin story to justify the materialistic character of those specific ideologies. So in one way, you can't say it's not all Darwin's doing. He was not a Nazi, but there were aspects of his thought that were consonant with National Socialism and indeed with Marxism that were picked up by these 19th or 20th century political ideologies. And the story that Richard Weikart documents is that essentially that Darwin influenced Haeckel and Huxley. Haeckel influenced Himmler, and Himmler influenced Hitler on these evolutionary ideas, and they ended up playing a significant role in his formulation of National Socialism. And this idea of helping the evolutionary process along politically by choosing certain races as being more fit for survival. Also, the idea of eugenics, which was practiced in the United States right up until World War II. It wasn't until the discovery of the death camps that the horror of the Nazi form of eugenics, that the so-called positive eugenics and some negative eugenics in the United States was terminated as a process. So yeah, these ideas have had some rather virulent expressions, though the scientific theory of Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, I think, has to be evaluated quite separately from the way in which others may have picked up those ideas and applied them in various political, ideological contexts.
Steve, the obvious question for some people listening to us might be to say, well, I get the intelligent design bit, that makes sense. We know that, but most people do think there's powerful evidence for a designer out there. I think that's a fair thing to say. But they might then say, should I then jump to the conclusion that evolutionary theory is all wrong? It didn't play a role in how we got to where we are. And well, I must believe in the story of 8-day creation, 7-day creation.
Very good question. The answer to that is no. My view, and that of many of the other leading proponents of the theory of intelligent design, is that the contemporary theory of evolution, called neo-Darwinism, is applicable within a definable range of phenomena. Now, that is to say, it explains certain things very well, but what it explains well are much more modest phenomena than it has been used to explain. It does a great job of explaining small-scale variation or adaptation of organisms to their environment, but it does a poor job of explaining the origin of what's called morphological innovation, the origin of new form as it arises in the fossil record. So, and typically, what you see is that the processes at work that the mutation selection mechanism or just natural selection operating explains well are processes that are not generating new information, but rather are expressing pre-existing forms of information, and then there's some sort of differential expression of that information that leads to differential survival and the fixation of some traits versus other traits in a population. So it's a good theory that has modest scope, whereas the problem that has come in where people have attempted to apply it universally to explain the origin of all forms of life on Earth, and it clearly can't do that. And the big problem there is the origin of the information, the origin of the body plans, the origin of new form. This is where it breaks down in the books that many of us have written. My book, Darwin's Doubt, Michael Behe's book, On the Edge of Evolution, and many others have sort of explained where Darwinism applies well, where neo-Darwinism is effective as a theory, and where it loses explanatory power, especially with respect to the origin of these major changes in the history of life. And that's where we see the evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence. It's a bit analogous, John. Oh, sorry to interrupt, but it's a bit analogous to Newtonian and Einsteinian physics. When Einstein came along and put Newtonian gravity in a broader picture with general relativity, we didn't say that Newtonian physics no longer had any value or benefit, but we saw that it was limited in its explanatory scope, and that there were things that it didn't explain that a broader explanatory framework explained better, and so we think natural selection is a real process. It has real powers, but the powers are not fundamentally creative in the sense of generating something new. There was a fairly important book written produced by two leading evolutionary biologists in the early 2000s that was published by MIT Press, called On the Origin of Organismal Form, and they had a chart in the first chapter of unsolved problems of neo-Darwinism, and one of them was simply the origin of biological form. So this is a pretty fundamental thing that we thought Darwin had explained back in 1859. Many evolutionary biologists are realizing the theory has not explained the origin of novelty, the origin of new forms of life in the history of life.
It does seem that people are debating issues of faith and of God more openly at the moment. The high watermark of the new atheism appears to have well and truly passed. In fact, you've seen quite a few new atheists, very prominent ones now, embracing personal faith. Even in Australia, we're very aware of the extraordinary reach of the Joe Rogan show, for example. The podcasting world is now very big. You and I are doing one, and a lot of people tap in. And you've been on that. Other articulate Christians, Wesley Huff, an amazing discussion that he had. Are you seeing or sensing a new spirit of inquiry abroad at the moment?
Absolutely. I had a call earlier today with Justin Brierley, who's written a book called The Surprising Rediscovery of God. And he was telling me about a new survey that's been done in the UK by some sociologists, I think, called The Quiet Revival. And there's been a rather dramatic uptick in church attendance in the United Kingdom since 2018, especially among young people. The rate of church attendance among young people, he told me, was 4% in 2018. It's now at 16%, and among young men, it's at 21%. But we're also seeing this, and I think maybe what's presaged this is a deep curiosity about the God question emerging among many people in the intellectual classes. You have books like Dominion by Tom Holland, the British historian who's discovered the importance of Christianity to the whole value system of the West, whether people are on the left or they're on the right. He says, look, we're all swimming in Christian waters. Where did we get this concern for the poor and the disenfranchised and the people who are crippled? And these are things that didn't exist in the ancient empires, but in the 2nd, 3rd century, you got concerned for the widows and orphans and people and slaves and disenfranchised persons of all kinds. Where did this come from? He said, this is something that came out of Christianity. You have, but I think around this question of science and God, the new atheists made this very, very strong argument that science properly understood undermines belief in God. This was the essential claim of the new atheism. In 2007, you had Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and you had lots of other people getting into the act. Lawrence Krauss, whom I've debated several times, wrote The Universe from Nothing. Even Stephen Hawking, near the end of his life, in a book called The Grand Design, kind of weighed in. But that, I think, that the arguments of the new atheists are increasingly a spent force. And I think it's largely because of the attention that has been focused on these major scientific discoveries that are perplexing from within a materialistic philosophical framework. The origin of the physical universe a finite time ago, what's called the Big Bang Theory or the singularity theorem from general relativity. These major developments in physics and cosmology point to something like a creation event. One of the key scientists who received a Nobel Prize for his work confirming the Big Bang Theory, Arno Penzias, who only died recently, was quoted as saying that the best data we have are exactly what I would have expected if we had nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. The idea was that if you take theism as a metaphysical hypothesis and you look at the world around us, what you see is basically what you would expect. You would expect to see evidence of design. You would expect to see evidence of a creation event. Richard Dawkins has formulated the issue very similarly, and he said that the universe we see has exactly the properties we would expect if it were the product of blind, pitiless indifference. No design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And I use that as a framing quotation in my book because when you look at the evidence from cosmology that we have for a definite beginning to the universe, that wasn't expected on a materialistic or atheistic worldview. When you look at the fine-tuning, that was also not expected. When the discovery of the digital code and the complexity of life at the cellular level, again, not expected from a materialistic point of view. In fact, Dawkins has said that he reacted to some animations that were produced by an Australian group a few years ago, depicting the way in which the digital code is directing the construction of proteins and the way in which genes are replicated. And he said he was knocked sideways with wonder at the complexity of the digital information processing system inside the cell. The 19th century materialists expected that the cell would be a homogeneous globule of plasm. And that's not what we've discovered. We've discovered features in the cell that are reminiscent of our own high-tech digital technology. And so in whether it's cosmology, physics, or biology, the discoveries of modern science have been more affirmative. They've been more consistent with the expectations that are generated from a theistic hypothesis than they are from a materialistic hypothesis. And I think that's had a profound shift in opening a lot of minds.
It's interesting, I think, that I don't think I'm putting words in Richard Dawkins' mouth when I say that he's come to much the same conclusion that both G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis did when they said that, when you stop believing in God, you don't start believing in nothing, you believe in anything. And I think Dawkins has been truly frightened by some of the madness and the anti-scientific nonsense, as he sees it himself, such as pretending that there are more genders than simply two. And that's been a real problem for him. And it's brought him to the point where he said, well, I'm perhaps a cultural Christian after all, because what's happening now is the emergence of a lot of really non-scientific stuff, really non-rational stuff.
Well, and there's a certain logic to that because science was born out of a Judeo-Christian intellectual milieu. In Return of the God hypothesis, in my book, I start not with getting right into the argument about what does the current science say, but rather I start with telling the story of the history of science, the origin of modern science, in that crucial period that scientists call the scientific revolution, or that historians of science call the scientific revolution between, say, 1500 and 1750. And you find that not only were all the major players devout Christians, but they began to study the natural world in a systematic way for very explicitly biblical reasons, Judeo-Christian reasons. They believed that nature was an orderly system because they believed in a God of order. They believed that nature was intelligible and could be understood, that it had patterns of order that could be discerned and designs that could be discerned by the human mind, because the same God who made our minds in his image endowed the natural world with a form of that rationality, so that there was a principle of correspondence between, as the Cambridge physicist John Polkinghorne used to put it, the reason within matches the reason without, the reason in the external world. And so you had this, science was born of a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think what Dawkins has inadvertently discovered is that in tossing that aside, he's opened the floodgates to all sorts of irrational ideologies. And the science that he prizes so greatly is being swept away in the flood. And this is part of the story that Justin Brierley tells about this internal kind of fracturing that took place among members of the New Atheist movement starting around 2014, that you have the uber woke and the anti woke suddenly sort of at each other's throats within the atheist movement itself, and lacking an objective standard of morality to which they could appeal. There was this inevitable fracturing, ideological fracturing within the movement. And I think you're right. One of the things that has I think been a very great cautionary note for a number of new atheists is the kind of irrational ideologies that are emerging, when they thought that by affirming atheism, they would be protecting rationality from the benighted religious people. They found that what I think they are finding, whether they acknowledge it or not, is that apart from the presuppositions that made science possible that came out of revealed religion, you will find culturally a loss of scientific trust in science and a kind of proliferation of very non-scientific modes of thinking, very irrational modes of thinking.
Well, Steve, you're not just a scientist, you're a philosopher. And we're told that, in fact, the case against God is less now in the minds of skeptics about science and science proving or disproving God. In fact, I often wonder what sort of God would allow himself to be proven or disproven by science anyway. But the real issue now for a lot of people is suffering, the problem of evil. Is that, in your view, where we've got to? The debate has moved. It's not so much the question of is there a God, but if there is one, why does he allow evil?
Well, I'm always asked about that. I think there are still, well, I think that's a very keen observation, actually. The perceptive observation. There's a very prominent young atheist in the United Kingdom, Alex O'Connor, and I'm scheduled to have a conversation with him, moderated by Justin Brierley soon. And the Piers Morgan people have also asked us to come on and talk with each other. And Alex is a very interesting figure in that he's, I think, a genuine metaphysical seeker. He's really seeking answers to the deep questions. He's got a big following in his own podcast. And in recent years, he has kind of moderated from the staunch new atheist position, which was that science undermines belief in God, to a position of less atheistic and more agnostic. But I think his key question and concern or objection or to adopting a theistic position or a Christian faith is the problem of evil. And so I'm, eager to have that conversation with him. When I was on Piers Morgan, they asked me about it, and I think Rogan asked me about it as well. But it's, to my way of thinking, that the primary question is, how did everything get here? And I think there's a sort of priority in looking at the two questions. The origins question is primary because you have to account for how things got here in the first place. The concern about, well, why are things not as much as we might like them to be, is a bit secondary in the following sense. If I look at an internal combustion engine and I see that it's rusted or that some of its parts are broken, it doesn't obviate the obvious evidence for the design of the engine in the first place. It raised a second question, which is, how were things broken? And I think what the atheistic argument from the problem of evil does is it reverses that priority, and it wants to say, well, because things aren't exactly as we want them, or because there is genuine evil in the world, there cannot be a God. But that leaves unanswered the question of where things came from in the first place, especially, I think, in light of the failure of things like evolutionary theory or the incoherence of materialist explanations like the multiverse for the origin of the fine-tuning or the origin of the universe. I think the theistic explanations for the key origins questions, the origin of the universe, the origin of the structure of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of new forms of life, the origin and nature of consciousness, I think the theistic explanations for those fundamental questions are hands down better. And so for me, the problem of evil, I think, is put in a different frame, which is to say, well, if there is evidence for a God, then how did things get the way they are, where we see both evidence of beauty, of goodness, but also of decay, of death and suffering. And there, I think the traditional Judeo-Christian biblical answer is certainly logically consistent. It tells us that there is a backstory, that there was a point in which humans rejected God's commands and his design for human flourishing, and that resulted in deleterious consequences, not only for our own lives, but for nature itself. And there's nothing terribly logically inconsistent about that, but it requires us to accept the backstory. And that's been conveyed to us through biblical revelation. And I think if you have good reasons to believe in the reality, or the biblical text and its revelation, then it's much easier to accept the backstory. If you have doubts about the biblical text, the historical reliability of the Bible, for example, or whatever it is, then that may leave you puzzled. But I think the basic idea that this the incompatibility of um, of evil or bad things happening to good people, or however it's framed, and the existence of God. I don't think there's a logical incompatibility there when you consider the role of agency, that God created creatures who, out of his goodness, were granted the same type of agency and what we call free will that he himself had. And in so doing, he took a risk. And the risk was that we would use that agency to harm others or degrade his creation or to do things that would result in what we call evil. To me, that's a satisfying answer. And I look forward to the conversation with Alex and others about that. But it is, it's everyone feels this existentially. I've just lost two parents in 2 years. We just buried my dad on Friday, and so you feel the sting of death, and it seems profoundly unnatural and doesn't seem like it could have possibly been intended. And for me as a Christian, I take great comfort in the biblical revelation and the teachings of Christ, to the very pointed effect that it wasn't what God intended, but it was a consequence of the actions of agents in opposition to his will.
So perhaps to pull this together, it seems to me that I find us in agreement that there is a compelling case that there is a God. There is a compelling case, surely, that he should not be ignored if he's there, and that the most compelling way to understand our place in the universe and our relationship with God is in fact to be found in the Christian story, with its explanation of what Pascal called the glory and the scum, each of us bearing the stamp of nobility, but deeply flawed by what Christians call the fall.
Oh, yeah. John Lennox, in his conversation recently with Alex O'Connor, called it the beauty in the bones. We see both. And I do liken it to, just very simply, to something like a rusted engine. We see the evidence of aboriginal design, and we see the evidence of subsequent decay. We see that in our own natures, and we see that as human beings, and we see that in nature itself. And this is something that you would expect if you took the biblical hypothesis about reality as a something to be explored. If you look at Romans 1, it says that from the things that are made, the unseen qualities of the Creator are clearly manifest. If you look at Romans 8, same letter, St. Paul, he says that the creation, the created order, is itself groaning for its redemption, that it's been subjected to decay. So as a Christian, as I look at the natural world around me, I would expect to see both evidence of original design and evidence of subsequent decay. That I see both of those things in nature as well as in human nature, to me, confirms the biblical hypothesis about reality. I have a confirmation of hypothesis, which is how you test an idea if you have a scientific or philosophical turn of mind. So I find the faith to be very rational in that it matches reality. It matches what you would expect to see in the world around us based on the revelation of the biblical text.
Well, Steve, you've done a wonderful job of making very complex ideas and scientific insights intelligible to lay people like me. And that's a great gift, and it's very generous of you to devote so much time and effort to helping people unpack what surely in the end is the number one question: who am I? And how do I relate to the universe around me?
Well, you're a very accomplished layperson, John. So I'm very honored to be on your podcast. It's a great fun. One of my other colleagues was on with you and enjoyed it very much, so he recommended it. So thank you for reaching out.
Thank you very much.